mankind's road to the stars had its unsung heroes. One of them was the Soviet cosmonaut Vladimir Komarov. His spaceflight on Soyuz 1 made him the first Soviet cosmonaut to fly into outer space more than once, and he became the first human to die on a space mission. He was killed when the Soyuz 1 space capsule crashed after re-entry on April 24, 1967, due to a parachute failure. However, because he died when the capsule crashed into the ground, he is not considered the first human fatality in outer space. The above photograph shows the charred remains of Komarov being looked over by Soviet officials during his open casket funeral. Only a chipped heel bone survived the crash. All this foretold tragedy started with the 50th anniversary of the founding of the Soviet Union. And the government demanded something big from the space program. Leonid Brezhnev, leader of the Soviet Union, decided to stage a spectacular mid-space rendezvous between two Soviet spaceships. The plan was for two Soviet space vehicles to launch into space and perform a dramatic orbital docking that would allow cosmonauts to move between ships. The first capsule to be launched would be the Soyuz 1, with Komarov inside. The next day, a second vehicle, Soyuz 2, would take off, with two additional cosmonauts. The two vehicles would meet, dock, Komarov would crawl from one vehicle to the other, exchanging places with a colleague, and come home in the second ship. Brezhnev made it very clear he wanted this to happen. Komarov was selected to command the Soyuz 1 in 1967, with Yuri Gagarin as his backup cosmonaut. Both knew the space capsule was not safe to fly, but everyone in the space program was terrified of Brezhnev's reaction to the mission being delayed or scrubbed. Komarov told friends he knew he would probably die. But he wouldn't back out because he didn't want Gagarin to die. Vladimir Komarov was among Gagarin's best friends. Gagarin showed up to the launch in full gear and tried to convince the crew to let him pilot the craft instead, but the crew including Komarov refused to let him, and Komarov flew the ship, almost certainly knowing that he was likely to die. 8 minutes later, Vladimir Komarov was in orbit operating one of the most sophisticated spacecraft ever launched. The trouble started at once when one of the Soyuz's two solar panels failed to deploy, starving the craft of electrical power and obscuring some of the navigation equipment. Despite his heroic efforts to save the mission, worse was to come. He successfully re-entered the Earth's atmosphere on his 19th orbit, but as the cabin descended through the atmosphere, the drogue parachute came out, but the main parachute remained stubbornly in its container. When the reserve chute was popped out, it tangled in the lane of the drag chute of the main parachute. Soyuz 1 crashed at great speed into the steppe at Orenburg at 7 a.m., killing Komarov. The cabin exploded on impact, and when Soviet Air Force recovery teams arrived, all they found was burning metal, the rim of the top of Soyuz being the only hardware they could identify. The consensus afterward was that the whole mission had been rushed before Soyuz was really ready. Vladimir Komarov's death seems to have been almost scripted. Yuri Gagarin said as much in an interview he gave to Pravda weeks after the crash. He sharply criticized the officials who had let his friend fly. The Gagarin of 1967 was very different from the carefree young man of 1961. Komarov's death had placed an enormous burden of guilt on his shoulders. Komarov was honored with a state funeral in Moscow, and his ashes were interred in the Kremlin Wall necropolis at Red Square. The American astronauts requested the Soviet government to allow a representative to attend but were turned down. Komarov was posthumously awarded his Second Order of Lenin and also the Order of Hero of the Soviet Union. Alright folks, for more such videos subscribe to Oddity and hit that bell icon too. Adios.